I have spent 40 years of my life 400 meters under Calderon Reach, and in all that time, I had never once heard the deep harmonics sing the way they sang the night the choir came home. The hollow vault is not a museum. People think of an archive as a place where the past goes to rest. Ours was a place where the past stayed awake. Every shift, someone walked the listening floor and read the long, slow hum coming up through the bedrock from the loom, the ward lattice my ancestors began laying down within a year of the rupture, and never once stopped extending. 85,000 years of engineers had tuned that hum to the exact frequency of a wound that refused to fully close. My job, and the job of every archivist before me, was to make sure no one ever forgot why the wound mattered. I knew the record by heart before I could walk a straight line. I knew the shape of what came through Calderon Reach the first time, not invaders in the way history likes to flatten things, but a single mind wearing 10,000 bodies, arriving with the calm certainty of something that had never once needed to ask permission to take a world. It had taken a fifth of the old population before the first generation even understood what they were fighting. It had taken 3 more generations to drive it back through the tier it came from. What it left behind was a crater the size of a sea, glassed flat in places where the fighting had gone on longest, and a species that decided, with a kind of grim unanimity history rarely manages, that it would never again be caught not knowing. The vault itself sits in the old blast shadow, carved into bedrock that still carries a faint residual warmth, 85,000 years on, if you know how to read the deep thermal charts the way I do. Every wall down there is lined with record, not paper, not anymore, but lattice crystal, grown specifically to outlast the species that wrote into it, so that even if every living archivist died in a single night, the knowledge of the choir would not die with us. We rehearsed the Reach reopening the way a watchman rehearses a fire he has never seen, because his grandfather told him, fire is the one thing you do not get to relearn from nothing. So we built the loom, not a wall, a listening structure that wrapped the whole planet, married to cities that grew up around it instead of in spite of it, married to warships that flew with its harmonics baked into their hulls, married to an archive whose only purpose was to keep the memory of the enemy sharper than the memory of the war. We did not wait for the choir to come back stronger. We assumed it would, and we used 85,000 years to make sure that when it did, the silence on this side of the Reach would not mean what it used to mean. The night it returned, the listening floor did not scream. It simply stopped being quiet in the particular way it had been quiet for my entire life, and every archivist in the vault felt that absence the way you'd feel a missing tooth. I watched the Reach reopen on the deep sensors, not a door, more like a seam giving way under pressure it had been holding for 1,000 centuries. What came through first wasn't ships. It was silence of a different kind, a directed, listening silence. The choir reaching ahead of itself the way it always had, testing for the absence it remembered leaving. It found a planet that answered back. I have read enough of the old accounts to recognize what must have happened in that first hour from their side, even though I never stood among them. The choir's vanguard came through, expecting a world still nursing its scar, perhaps a few scattered survivors clinging to the crater's edge, perhaps nothing at all. Instead, its listening swept across a hemisphere and met cities standing taller than anything it had catalogued on its way out, megastructures threaded through the sky, in patterns that were not defensive in the frightened sense. They were patient, deliberate, built by people who had never once stopped expecting this exact night. The loom answered the choir's first probing pulse with something the record calls, simply, recognition. Not a weapon discharge. A pattern, broadcast back across every frequency the choir used to speak with itself, showing it its own signature from 85,000 years ago, mapped, indexed, cross-referenced against every harmonic shift it had undergone since. We did not just remember that the choir existed, we had been listening for it the entire time it was gone. I have spoken since with engineers who manned the surface ward stations that night, and they all described the same thing. The moment the choir's collective signal staggered. Not panic. The choir does not panic the way a single mind does, but a ripple of discord running through 10,000 linked voices as each of them, simultaneously, understood the same impossible fact. The world they had come to reclaim had spent the entire span of their absence preparing specifically for them. They came anyway. I think that is the part worth saying plainly, because it would be easy to tell this as a story where the enemy simply turned and fled once it understood. It didn't. Whatever the choir is, at its root, it does not relinquish a claim once made, not even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the claim has already been lost. Its vanguard pressed inland from the reach, and the loom met it the way 85,000 years of restraint had decided it would be met. Not with annihilation, though we had the means, and not with mercy mistaken for weakness, but with a single calculated act we had debated and rehearsed for longer than most nations have existed. The loom did not aim at the choir's bodies, it aimed at the link between them. I was on the listening floor when the harmonics inverted. It is the only time in 40 years I have felt the bedrock itself seem to flinch. The loom found the exact resonance that bound 10,000 minds into one continuous voice, and it cut it, not gently, not without cost, because severing a hive link of that scale tears something loose in every mind it runs through, and not every body on that field survived the tearing. That is the price I will not pretend away. Some of them did not wake up alone. They simply stopped. But some did. I met one of them 3 weeks later, in a quiet room 2 levels above the listening floor, because the protocols my predecessors had written 85,000 years ago specified that someone from the vault be present when a survivor first spoke as itself, rather than as a chorus. It did not have a name yet. It had never needed one. It sat very still, the way something sits when it is relearning the size of its own skull, flexing fingers it had spent 10,000 lifetimes never having to think about, and it asked me, in a voice that still carried the flattened cadence of 10,000 throats, why we had not simply ended it on the field, when we so clearly could have. I told it the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had been trained my entire life to offer. We had not built 85,000 years of readiness to become the thing that took without listening. We built it so that the next time something arrived believing this world was finished, it would leave understanding exactly how wrong it had been, and carry that understanding somewhere the choir's remnant could hear it, mind to mind, the way nothing else would ever convince them. It listened to that for a long time without answering, and when it finally spoke again, it was not to argue. It asked instead how long we had known it was coming. I told it the truth a second time. We had not known the night, only that the night would eventually arrive, and that not knowing the night was never an excuse to stop preparing for it. 4 of them went back through the reach before we sealed it again, this time with wards 3 generations deep instead of 1. I do not know what they told the rest of the choir when they returned to whatever remains of it on the other side. I know only that the reach has stayed quiet since, quieter even than before, and that I still walk the listening floor every shift, the way my mother did, the way her mother did, the way someone will walk it 85,000 years from now, if this world is patient enough to last that long. People ask me sometimes whether it was worth it. The centuries of vigilance spent on an enemy that might never have returned at all. I tell them what I told the thing with no name, the night before we sent it home. Readiness is not a debt you pay once and call settled. It is the only inheritance worth leaving a planet that has already learned, the hard way, what it costs to be found wanting. The hum in the bedrock has not changed since. I still listen to it every night before I sleep, the way you'd listen for a heartbeat you trust, precisely because you have never once let yourself stop checking.